this lesson, you'll learn about 3 types of services contracts: the fixed bid or fixed scope, time and materials, and a retainer-based contract. You'll also hear about the iron triangle: budget, scope, and timeline, and how these elements are controlled or can flex in these different types of agreements. Finally, you'll learn about how a contract can imply a certain level of trust, and how building successful relationships with clients can lead to future, more mutually favorable agreements.
For us at Lullabot, there are our service contracts for development, at least, tend to fall into 3 broad categories. Those categories are time and materials, retainer-based contracts, and then fixed bid, fixed scope contracts. Basically, they're all sort of different ways of slicing the same thing. You're tackling the same work at the end of the day, but it's how you structure the agreement. And the way those work is essentially time and materials is the most simplest. It's a one-to-one relationship. I log any hours that I work, and those hours get billed. Retainer is very similar, but slightly different in the fact that the way retainer agreements are set up is to say, okay, you have an individual's time, like maybe 30 hours a week or a certain amount of time per month, and there's a flat rate for that time regardless of how many hours actually end up being used. The last is fixed bid, fixed scope contracts, and those in a lot of ways are the most risky contracts because the way they work is essentially after some period of due diligence or estimation or discovery, we as a company are saying, okay, we fully understand these scope and requirements enough to put a fixed price on them regardless of how much time it takes to actually complete the work. So naturally, if you're a service provider, you do a contract like that, it can come back and bite you in a lot of ways.
At Lullabot, we tend to work in one of 3 engagement models. And the 3 different engagement models are either fixed bid, and these contracts are usually much more elaborate. Usually there's a discovery preceding the fixed bid, where the team goes in and basically explores as much as possible the work that needs to be done. They'll do what's called a work breakdown structure, which is essentially top-down design of the project. And what that means is you start to break the project up into, I like to use the phrase, core initiatives. Like a modern web project for a television station, we know they're going to need advertising and analytics. We know they're going to need editorial workflows. We know they're going to need video. We know they're going to need a blog. So you start to break it up into these overarching categories, and then you break those overarching categories into smaller and smaller pieces. So let's take a blog. Okay, a blog needs to be designed, a blog needs to be programmed. We need to figure out what modules we want to use for that blog. We need to test the blog once it's been, created, those types of things. So you start to break down all of the tasks that need to happen in the project, and then you estimate those tasks. Once you have that estimate, you present that to the client. They, haggle with you, for lack of a better description, until you come to a mutual agreement on the budget and the scope for a project. And that's a fixed bid. So once you sign that document, you've committed to finishing a body of work as described in what's called a work breakdown structure in a certain amount of time at a certain cost. Now, if requirements change in the middle of that, then you have to do a change order, which is another document usually provided for in the contract itself. You'll have a change order form that both sides agree to. Here's how we're going to make changes when we need to as the project proceeds. And so ideally in a fixed bid project, the requirements are set up front, and this type of project tends to lend itself really well to the typical waterfall process as it's described in project management.
So when we start a relationship with a client, it usually falls into one of 2 styles of working, one of which is the fixed price contract, where the client wants a specific outcome for a specific amount of money at a specific amount of time. And those are contracts that typically are going to require a lot of control on the part of the project manager to make sure that we hit those specific goals. What are you building for how much money by when? By contrast, there's sort of the retainer or the time and materials contract, where you and the client are working together to achieve a goal, and there isn't as much of a set boundary around each of those three items. We call this the iron triangle: time, money, and features, or time, money, and scope is often how it's referenced. With a retainer model, you don't have to do as much of that. You just work with the client. So you can see time and money and stuff, when the client is very concerned about that, it actually evidences a lack of trust, because maybe this is a new relationship. When there's a lot of trust between a client and their vendor, they can have a retainer contract, and they know that the retainer is not going to burn them, and the vendor is not going to just take advantage of them. So for people that we work with at Lullabot, that we have a retainer relationship with, it's usually the result of previous successful projects. When we have a brand new relationship with someone, it tends to be a fixed bid, and we have to be very careful to make sure that we land it, because in a fixed bid, all the benefit is to the client, basically. They're protected on how much money they have to pay, and they can hold us to how much time we have to build that thing. So that takes a lot more work on the part of the project manager.
It's not a surprise. A lot of times, initial projects, when you first work with a client, they tend to be very guarded, and because there's not a whole lot of trust built up there. And so that's why a lot of times initial contracts tend to be more fixed bid, fixed scope, because they sort of want a guarantee for their spend. Hey vendor, I want to make sure that when I spend this money, I get the result that I'm looking for. Time and materials and retainer-based contracts tend to imply a little bit more trust, though it's not necessarily always trust. It could just be that requirements aren't fully fleshed out, or scope is naturally going to change, and both parties are sort of acknowledging that. But for the most part, you tend to see more time and materials or fixed or retainer-based contracts where in relationships where trust has been truly established. I think that's because if you are confident in somebody's quality of work and their ability to produce good work, you're going to give them a bit more latitude with time, a bit more latitude around the actual deliverables, and those sorts of things.
The second type of contract is simply time and materials, which everyone knows from their plumber or their carpenter, where it basically says, we'll get paid by the hour, we'll do whatever you need us to do, we'll organize however you need us to organize, and hopefully both sides have a greater degree of trust in these scenarios, and it allows for more agile methodologies. It allows for the software itself, software is inherently flexible and malleable, almost to a fault, because that also engenders a lot of complexity. But with agile techniques, you can really play to the advantages of that flexibility of software and change and iterate as you go. And so time and materials contracts are well suited to that. The third kind of contract is similar to time and materials in that it's really a client is paying for your time. It's called a retainer. And the difference with retainers is that clients usually pay a little bit more of a premium, and then they have a committed team for a certain number of weeks or months at a certain number of hours. That creates a partnership in a way that the other two models don't. Essentially, you're almost becoming part of that client's staff at a known number of hours per week for a known time period. The contract will then specify. And that allows both sides to really just dive in almost as equal partners on the project. And I think that can be very effective, especially when you have two teams, let's say a client team and a consultant team, that need to fully integrate in the service of a project. And that's much harder to do in fixed bid scenarios where scope and money are sort of all tied up with who's doing the work. And you can't be as flexible and maybe even as efficient in those scenarios.
One distinction that I do want to make that's kind of a unique challenge of retainer-based agreements is keep in mind again, retainers are basically saying you're paying a flat fee for a particular individual or team for a particular amount of time, regardless of the actual hours that they work. So you're saying, here's my cost per week for this team. And the team may have busy weeks, may have not busy weeks. One PM challenge that's inherent to that type of agreement specifically is the situation where a team is routinely underpacing their hours or routinely overpacing their hours. because that ends up being a challenge, triggering a necessary conversation with the client of, either more aggressively setting boundaries or revisiting the numbers of resources on the project, or conversely, trying to identify, is this team not being optimally utilized? Like, is there something else that they can be working on? And if not, does the contract need to come back into question and need to be revisited? It's interesting that project managers do, their job is to make a project work within the constraints of that project. And one of the things that you could definitely say about fixed bid projects is at least those constraints are out there and they're known by everybody. A lot of times with more time and materials retainer based projects, the constraints are harder to identify. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but they interplay with each other. So scope, timeline, budget. Usually, budget is not infinite. Those are being able to suss out what the constraints are there is very critical. Timeline is more of an ongoing conversation and negotiation that's inextricably linked to scope. Sometimes you can pull the budget lever, but money conversations are a lot of times pretty sensitive. I think both scenarios are very challenging, but they both flex different PM muscles. In theory, it's actually really difficult, to be on a fixed bid project, because just because something's fixed bid, fixed scope, and the restraints are known by everybody, it doesn't mean that you're going to you aren't going to avoid having crucial conversations. Timelines slip, the project plan goes awry, and you're sort of starting behind the 8 ball because everybody is on the same page with scope and deliverables. So when those bumps in the road or roadblocks inevitably happen, it's a bit more of an immediate firefight situation. You're already sort of starting in this this damage control, exception handling type of capacity, whereas with time and materials and retainer-based agreements, some of that, there's a little more leeway with that, but at the same time, you need to have a bit more of a nuanced, people skills around, really sort of communicating how the project's going, because it's not clearly defined. It's not something where you can say, okay, we are quite clearly right here in this project. It's, well, we're here in this project, we want to get to here, here are the different things, here are the different paths that we can go. And, for some people, I think they naturally fit in that sort of, fluid conversation is very, very comfortable for them. And for others, I think they find comfort in the rigor of a fixed project.
In this lesson, we learned about 3 types of services contracts. In a fixed bid contract, projects are detailed in scope, timeline, and budget, and tend to lend themselves to waterfall methodologies or a hybrid waterfall plus agile approach. Time and materials contracts require a more nuanced project management style to discover the real constraints of the project. Finally, retainer-based contracts essentially form a partnership between the client and the vendor. Work is prioritized on an ongoing basis, and a higher level of trust is usually implied. This trust has usually been established through a series of good experiences with the past project.